Before Anexa's release, there were three main things I wanted to find out. Firstly, is Anaxa hypercarry truly as strong or better than even 2.x damage carries? Secondly, how big of an improvement is Anaxa over Servo or maybe even Jade in the Herta teams? And finally, how good is Anaxa's pull value? Before we tackle these questions, I want to break down Anaxa's kit so you can first better understand what he does, because Theorycrafting alone will not give you the full picture. The way Anaxa's kit functions in battle is fairly straightforward. His attacks implant weaknesses for every hit. A very common misconception is that this implant does anything other than extra toughness reduction. This does not work like Silverwolf's skill. On top of implanting a weakness, Silverwolf also reduces the enemy's damage rest. This is what effectively allows her to deal with any enemy in the game, because they usually have an innate 20% damage rest to other types. But for Anaxa, all he does is implant the weakness, but he doesn't reduce the damage rest. Meaning in Memory of Chaos, Anaxa can actually be playing at minus 20% damage if there is no wind weakness, which can kinda suck sometimes if you're trying to play him with the Herta, because there are not a lot of enemies with both ice and wind weakness, or rather most of these enemies are just kinda old, but there's a pretty low chance they appear in endgame content again. All the weakness implant really does is some extra toughness reduction, but more importantly, it's for himself. Because when enemies reach 5 weaknesses, Anaxa's talent allows him to perform a second automatic skill whenever he uses a basic or skill on the enemy that has the 5 weaknesses. Basically, buy one get one free, and he even gets an additional 30% damage boost against these enemies. That's not all, he also gets up to 28% defense ignore based on the number of weaknesses the enemy has. So other than extra toughness reduction, which can be somewhat useful in Apocalyptic Shadow, it really only benefits Anaxa himself. The weakness implant doesn't make your team super universal or anything crazy like that, and saying this is Silverwolf power creep is kinda bizarre, because she has already been power creeped, just in a different way. Silverwolf is still technically the best at making your team universal, provided there are only 1 or 2 targets. Whether or not that is useful is a different thing altogether. His ultimate also helps with the uptime of weaknesses and inflicts the sublimation state that just gives enemies all 7 weaknesses for about 1 turn, allowing you to proc his talent instantly if you don't have the 5 weaknesses from his other attacks yet. So what does his skill even do? It's quite literally Sampo's skill, but much better. It's a bounce attack, 1 targeted 4 bounce for a total of 350% attack, and it also gets a 20% damage boost for every attackable enemy in the field. So you can get an additional 100% on top of the previous 30% damage boost at 5 targets. A nice feature of this skill is that it prioritizes hitting enemies that have yet to be attacked. So against 5 enemies, this is always an AoE attack. The reason why this is even any good is because of units like Tribi and the Herta, who regenerate extra energy based on the number of enemies hit. This also makes Anaxa extremely flexible, or rather even more flexible than he already is. Bounce attacks are simply the most efficient kind of attack or damage in the game. It's why most huge AoE units have a bounce attack at the end, Acheron, Uni, and most recently Casteris. If there are 5 targets, Anaxa will hit all of them. If there is only 1, his skill becomes a 350% single target attack, and that is what makes Anaxa so flexible. He has the means to deal with any kind of scenario, but it also means he's not the best in either single target or full AoE. A jack of all trades, but a master of none. Funnily enough, Anaxa is not just flexible in terms of dealing damage, but also in team building and even relics. In a hypercarry team, he can use Sunday, RMC, Tribi, Robin, Rame, Bronya, and so on. And when it comes to builds, he can use Genius, Scholar, Eagle, Rotidon, Izumo, and maybe even Pioneer. Hoyoverse again is not very specific with what is a debuff and what is affected by ERR, so I'm not super sure if you can make good use of Pioneer. Unfortunately, when it comes to relics, Eagle doesn't turn Anaxa into some crazy action advanced unit like Servo, not only because he requires 2 turns to use his ultimate after the first, but also because high speed doesn't do a whole lot for him. Let's say you're using Tribi with 1 use of S5 dance. If you want to get 3 actions in the first 150 action value, you require a pretty ridiculous 167.4 speed. Maybe doable, but borderline impossible. If you now run Sprightly on top of D1 dance, you require 140 speed, which is a lot easier to achieve. But if we run Sprightly, Anaxa obviously loses damage, which is not ideal when you want him to do damage. So we ideally have to get 2 uses of dance without Sprightly, and this only requires 151.5 speed, but needs some player skill. And if you run Robin, you're pretty much guaranteed 3 actions with even 134 speed and maybe even lower, so it doesn't really matter a whole lot. Obviously, higher speed matters more in the Apocalyptic Shadow because they measure in action value, not in cycles, but in Memory of Chaos, going over 151.5 is pretty useless because you can't get a 4th turn, and the extra substats are better used for crit rate, crit damage, and attack. But anyways, we first have the Anaxa Hypercarry simulation with Sunday, Robin, and Gallagher running at 135 speed. In a 5 target scenario where his skill does maximum damage, he deals about 16,000 DPAV or damage per action value, and at 3 targets about 13,000. This puts him somewhere in between the 1.x and the 2.x units. He should still perform better than Jingyuan despite the DPAV or whatever, because his damage is much more efficient. But he will still fall behind most 2.x units like Acheron, Firefly, and Facial. He does, however, have some really good scenarios where he will probably beat out even 3.x units as a hyper carry, which is the current Apocalyptic Shadow with Hule. This stage is really good for him because it's 3 target and defeating the other mobs will save your action value, which is why he can perform at such a high level. But for most other content in the game, he performs well, but not on the same level of other hypercarries we already have. When it comes to his best in-slot team, which should be in the Madam Herta team on release, he is quite a massive increase over Serval, about a 60% increase in the 5 target scenario, and about 4% worse than Jade's best scenario, coming in at about pretty crazy 34,000 DPAV. This is about what I expected, but do keep in mind that oftentimes you deal more damage than you need because the Herta is incredibly inefficient with the damage. However, there's another very important thing you need to know. Anaxa contributes or performs much better in a Herta team when there are less enemies. Doesn't really make sense, right? But it's because he is able to use bounce attacks so frequently. In a 3 target scenario, it starts to shift in Anaxa's favor over Jade, which is why you can see his damage contribution increase. The truth is, in game, the difference should probably be even bigger, because Anaxa does similar damage even in lower target scenarios, unlike other erudition units who heavily rely on AoE attacks and having many enemies. Hence, I actually estimate the difference to be around 40% or maybe even higher in scenarios like Memory of Chaos, not to mention his damage efficiency, which contributes to clear speed despite looking like it deals the same damage on paper, and that is why the DPAV doesn't tell the whole story. Of course, there are some bosses that Jade definitely does better on, like the Banana Academy staff in Apocalyptic Shadow. This boss simply requires as many AoE attacks as possible, not so much how much damage you do, and since it's a shared HP boss with 5 targets, it's Jade's best scenario. Naturally, Jade is already a much better pick in Pure Fiction because of her automatic follow-ups, but that part should already be obvious. On the other hand, Anaxa makes Hule look like a little pup, but I imagine he will also be pretty good into Flame River and Nikodos as well. As a little summary, Anaxa's advantages are his extremely high flexibility because of his bounce attack, extra buffs for the team when used in double erudition teams, weakness implant being very useful for Apocalyptic Shadow, great ego user which again is very good for all game modes. He has many builds and teammates you can choose from, making it pretty easy to play or build him, and he can be played using basic attacks, which decreases his SP usage. For disadvantages, they are probably quite minor, but to get the best performance out of him, he is quite skill point intensive, which is not the best when the Herta herself is also extremely SP negative, which can only really be solved by getting the Herta's Light Cone. His weakness implant not reducing damage res can also hurt in dual carry teams, these 2 points being the most glaring weaknesses for me. I actually didn't complete the code from before. A jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. Anaxa's high performance in many scenarios allows him to be very flexible. He's really good in Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow when paired with the Herta, and there are even times when his hypercarry team does really well. But it's not like he's bad in Pure Fiction or 5 target scenarios either. He may clear slightly slower than the Jade and small Herta team, but it's like comparing an A+ against an A. He's still very competitive. Hence, I rate Anaxa at about tier 0.5 for Pure Fiction and around 0.5 to 0 for both Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow upon his release. Although I think he is really good right now, I still think to get the best value out of your pools, I would only get him if you are planning to get the Herta or you already have her. His individual damage as a hypercarry might not be high enough to keep up as the game progresses, and he may also falter slightly in super niche stages, but he does perform extremely well in double erudition teams, even in Memory of Chaos. If Memory of Chaos moves away from AoE content, you might start to find your Herta teams struggling, and that's where Anaxa would come in. Hence, I think in the long run, Anaxa will find the most comfort with the Herta due to their symbiotic relationship or perhaps even a new erudition down the line, and that's when Anaxa has a really high pull value. If you have Jade, you do have less incentive to pull Anaxa, so I guess it depends on how much longer you want to be using the Herta for. If you want to be constantly using her even against Memory of Chaos stages with less enemies, I would highly advise you to get Anaxa even if you already have Jade. If you think you might move away from the Herta and use other teams instead, it's probably fine to skip Anaxa then. Anyways, I've given you a small glimpse at Anaxa's builds, but I will be releasing a more detailed video in a few days time on how exactly to build him, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you.